Hey, real progressives. This is Jackie Lukeman, and I am going to talk to you today about an issue that is in the news very prominently, aside from Bernie Sanders' amazing speech last night and the conflicting reports in the mainstream media about his interviews this morning. He did not concede. He is not supporting Hillary Clinton. He said he would vote for her if she is the Democratic nominee, but he is still fighting. We are going to the convention, but that's not what I want to talk to you about today. Just wanted to clear that up. What I want to talk to you about today is this fiasco that happened in Congress, in the House, with the House Democrats staging this sit-in to demand a vote on a gun control measure that includes a provision that honestly is a violation of the civil rights of Americans of the Muslim faith and Americans of Arabic descent. And that is the provision that includes this ridiculous terror watch list, this no-fly watch list. Now, I'm trying to maintain my composure because this really makes me angry on so many levels that particular people are involved in pushing for this legislation. And let me explain to you why first. This relying on this terror watch list to deny people the right to purchase a firearm is a serious problem. The terror watch list, or the no-fly list, as some people call it, is this kind of secretive, shady list of people that the government has created after 9/11 to identify people who are supposed to be a terrorist threat to the United States. Now that seems reasonable because we don't want to harbor terrorists in this country. We do not want to embolden them, and we want to be safe in this country, flying and traveling. And okay, fine, that's wonderful. But the way the list operates violates people's civil rights because the list targets and ensnares people of Muslim faith or people of Arabic or ethnic origin, basically people who have quote unquote Islamic or Muslim sounding names, right? And I wish I were making that up, but I'm not. I know several people who actually are from Arab countries. I know people who are Muslims, Black Muslims, who have changed their names from Christian names to Muslim names, and they've been placed on this no-fly list. And getting off this list requires hiring an attorney and fighting the U.S. government to prove that you're not a terrorist. And that can take years. In the meantime, while you're fighting the government to prove that you're not a terrorist, you're denied a passport. You're denied the ability and opportunity to fly. And God forbid, if you really are from another country, you may not be able to go home and visit your family. Furthermore, if you are on the list, according to the way the list operates now, family members, including children, can also be put on the list. And people who are on this list can be targeted by the government to force them to either become informants in order to give them a way to get off the list outside of litigation, or if people don't become informants for the government, then their continued name being on the list is used against them. They're punished, basically, for not cooperating with the government in turning in people by keeping their name on the list. So they can never get a passport. They can never fly. They can never travel. That's problematic. It's problematic that most of the people who are targeted are, as I said, people who are of the Muslim faith, people who have Arab sounding names, and that putting people on this list operates on a standard of quote unquote reasonable suspicion, which is very vaguely defined, and the guidelines that are defined are much, much lower than typical probable cause that we're guaranteed, supposedly, under the U.S. Constitution. So listen, as much as I want to make sure that people who should not have a gun for whatever reason are not allowed to have them, targeting innocent people to be placed on this secretive list where they can be blackballed and terrorized by the government just because the government doesn't like the way their name sounds is not the way to do it. There's a better way to do it. And if we're going to maintain this list and use it as a way to handle the people who should not be purchasing guns, then there needs to be better and more clear processes for innocent people to clear their names and get them off this list. Not just so they can buy a gun, but so that they can be treated like American citizens and not have their rights violated. All right. Now, I understand not everybody agrees with me on that, and that is completely okay. What I have a serious problem with is that anyone is all right with any American citizen's rights being violated and their right to due process being denied. Because as Black people in this country, we ought to be sick and tired of that, because that's been happening to us since we've been here. And it really bothers me in particular that someone like Representative John Lewis would give this impassioned speech on the House floor for the Republicans to allow them to vote so that the Democrats can vote for this provision that violates people's due process rights, and to do it in such a way that he intones this air of Black moral witness. That's what I'm calling it, because, we have a deep tradition in the Black community of being the moral witness of this country. And it goes back beyond the civil rights movement. It goes back to the very beginnings of the Black church and how we have used our faith to point out and condemn the violators of people's rights in this country when it comes to slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination and lynching and the abuse of women and the abuse of other groups of immigrant people and the violation of Native American rights. African Americans have always used our faith to point out the sins of this country. Our Black moral witness, that's what I'm decided to call it for lack of a better term, has been our strength in directing this country to be on the right side of history. So it concerns me a great deal when someone with the reputation of John Lewis would use that very powerful Black moral witness to advocate for this kind of legislation. As a progressive, I have my own personal views on gun ownership. We can talk about that on a different day. But what I will never, ever agree to as an African American, as an American, and as a progressive is the violation of any American citizen's constitutional and due process rights. What's even more bothersome for me in this whole gun control discussion and debate, and the desire that so many people have to rush to the defense of voting on any piece of legislation just to say that we're voting for something, just to say that, well, we're finally doing something, is there is not, and there has not been this same Black moral witness, this same public outrage, and the same support for Black people who have been fighting like hell for our lives in our neighborhoods against gun violence that nobody ever talks about. And I don't say this just as somebody who lives in a neighborhood that's recovering from some of the violence that we experienced in the past 30, 40 years because of the influx of drugs and guns from Reagan and his funding the Contras during the CIA crack scandal. Not talking about just that. I'm talking about the fact that Black religious and community leaders have gone to the White House and have presented our elected officials with programs that actually work in reducing gun violence in our communities. And we were told, not only by the White House, but we have also been told by the way our elected officials in Congress have voted on funding for this legislation, that our lives really don't matter. We've been told that there's no political will for us fighting for our lives in our fight against gun violence in our neighborhood. But Representative Lewis and all these other Democrats can stage a sit-in in Congress to push to vote for a piece of legislation that violates people's rights. But we can't get any help. I always like to have proof because I get so emotional. I don't want people to think I'm just talking out of the side of my neck. ProPublica published an article, I believe it was last year, outlining the fight that advocates for the ceasefire program have waged in getting funding to expand that program across the country between 2010 and 2013. And I'm going to read you some excerpts from this article that you can find in ProPublica, and I'm going to put the link to this article on this video when it is posted, so you can see what we're talking about here when I am telling you that there's this selective moral outrage, there's this selective Black witness from our Democratic Black elected officials when it comes to gun control. So the ProPublica article says that many people viewed inner city shootings as an intractable problem. But for 2 years, Pastor McBride and his colleagues have been spreading awareness about ceasefire, a nearly 2 decades old strategy that upended how police departments dealt with gang violence. Under ceasefire, police teamed up with community leaders to identify the young men most at risk of shooting someone or being shot, talked to them directly about the risk they face, offered them support, and promised a tough crackdown on the groups that continued shooting. In Boston, the city that developed ceasefire, the average monthly number of youth homicides dropped by 63% in the 2 years after it was launched. The U.S. Department of Justice's What Works website for crime policy had a green check mark next to ceasefire, labeling it effective. The highest rating and one of the few programs that received a rating that high. McBride wanted President Obama to make ceasefire and similar programs part of his post-Newtown push to reduce gun violence. He had brought a short memo to give to White House staffers outlining a plan to devote $500 million over 5 years to scaling such programs nationwide. His pitch to Biden that day was even simpler. Do not ignore that Black children are dying too. In response, the vice president agreed urban violence was very important, McBride said, but it was clear that there was not a lot of appetite for that conversation by folks in the meeting. Later, other ministers who worked with McBride would get an even blunter assessment from a White House staffer. There was no political will in the country to address inner city violence. Mass shootings, unsurprisingly, drive the national debate on gun violence, but as horrific as these massacres are, by most counts, they represent less than 1% of all gun homicides. America's high rate of gun murders isn't caused by events like Sandy Hook or the shootings in Oregon at the community college, or even Aurora or Orlando. It's fueled by a relentless drumbeat of deaths of black men. Gun control advocates and politicians frequently cite the statistic that more than 30 Americans are murdered with guns every day. What's rarely mentioned is that roughly half of the 30 every day killed by guns are black men. 20 years of government-funded research has shown there are several promising strategies to prevent murders of black men, including ceasefire. They don't require passing new gun laws or an epic fight with the National Rifle Association. What they need and often struggle to get, and we haven't gotten to this day, is political support. The support of other Americans and money. Liberals and progressives have erroneously, incorrectly, and misguidedly framed the debate on gun violence around what the NRA is doing and changing gun laws, and that's going to solve all of the problems. No, those things are going to solve some problems. Those things are needed, but those things are not going to solve our problems. And the issue is that conservatives and Republicans on the other side of the spectrum turn this issue, this discussion of gun violence in the black community, into a problem with our morals and our lack of family values. So in between the two, no one's talking about what we deal with. No one's listening to the solutions that we bring to the table. Everyone is saying we don't do anything about the violence in our communities, but there are programs that we have tried to get expanded throughout this country that defy that lie. And we have elected officials like Representative John Lewis and every other Democrat who participated in that sit-in who know about these kinds of programs, and we don't get their support. I am not at all saying that nothing should be done to keep people who are on the terror watch list from buying a gun. If you are legitimately under investigation for terrorist activities, of course you shouldn't be able to buy a gun or fly until your investigation is cleared, and you are cleared. But if you are innocent, you should have a way to clear your own name that doesn't further infringe upon your rights as an American citizen. But Democrats and progressives and liberals, we must stop believing that this conversation about gun violence is only limited to the NRA and changing laws and relying on the lists that violate people's rights. We also need this same kind of outrage, especially from our black elected officials, to fight for people who have been fighting for their lives every single day. Every single day in inner cities and in poor black and brown neighborhoods in this country. Nobody has fought for us. I am tired of the manipulation of the righteous black moral witness that the Democratic Party has used for too long, and that too many Democratic black elected officials have allowed them to use. I still have a great deal of respect for Representative Lewis because of his record, his history, and his work. But I am not going to continue to cover for our elected officials who do not fight for people who need help. We've been fighting for our lives in our communities for decades. We've been screaming for help, and we've not gotten it, even from a Democratic administration. I, for one, will not continue to allow the very powerful Black moral witness to be manipulated to support policies or candidates who will do none of us any good. I will post the link to the ProPublica article on this video. Thank you for listening. Stick to the fight. Do not give up, real progressives. This ain't over. We will see you in Philadelphia. Peace.